We did it. Correct. Good for us. So, hopefully you guys read it. So in 1962, unusually heavy rains during the dry season caused a massive buildup of blood-sucking stable flies in the crater. These flies drained the blood and caused skin sores, which infected the lions and made them sick. By the following year, the population of lions had crashed from between 75 to 100 to just 12. So in this activity, we will explore two different population models to discover the fate of the lion population. To answer the questions below, we will be using real data from Dr. Craig Packer's research on lions in the I can't say it. I'm not even going to try to say it, but in the crater. So which of the following questions interest you the most? Does anyone have a question that they think is most interesting out of those four?
A, like the first one.
So what factors can influence how populations change over time?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think definitely, especially as like animal ecologists in this lab, that would be a very interesting thing because that's often what people are investigating. Anybody else have any? Is there anybody that was interested in one of the other questions?
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm interested in C. How can we apply population models to real world data?
Do you like math, Cheyenne?
Yeah.
Well, good for you, because I don't like math. And but math skills are very, very important to have in ecology, and being able to apply population models to real world data is pretty much essential when you're doing a lot of these different studies, because we as humans like to compartmentalize things and make things fit into our own view of the world, right? So who was the other person that had an interest?
I had started saying that I was interested in D, so what inferences can we make about human population growth? Just because when I had read ahead, I read that we were going to be talking about it and relating it to human population growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like that's also an interesting question in terms of just like, I know in animal ecology, like I said, we'd be more interested in what factors can influence how populations change over time. But in terms of just like environmental science and our sustainability on the planet, that's also a very interesting question. So I'm gonna pick A because I like A because it has less math. So good work to us. We have interests. Okay, so population change over time, part one. So populations increase when more organisms enter a population than organisms leave it, right? Just makes sense. Or when more organisms are born than die. So the opposite is true. If the population decreases, it's because more organisms are leaving, or more of them are dying than are being born. So the data in this graph is hypothetical from 1950 to 1962, and researchers knew that there were about 75 to 100 lions in the crater, but they didn't start collecting data until the population crashed in 1963. So from 1960 to 1963, the population of lions in the crater decreased. Which of the following is most likely to have been true during this time period?
The more lions died every year than were born.
Yeah, because if you had more lions immigrating than emigrating, your population would go up. And if you had more lions dying every year, more lions immigrating than emigrating, your population would go up. And more lions died every year than were born, your population would go down. And if no lions died, you would just have them being born. So therefore, you would just keep increasing your population. So therefore, we have B. So what would have had to have been true on average from 1952 to 1956? So from 52 to 56-ish, the population's going up, right, during this little orange period. So if the population
is higher than death rate.
Yeah, exactly. You'd have a birth rate higher than a death rate. So this one is more fun, and I'm not going to type out a whole answer for this. But what do you predict will happen to the lion population after 1963? So does anyone have any predictions?
I feel like eventually the lion population would start to increase because there'd be more resources for them.
Mm-hmm. Very good prediction. Because when you have, as we discussed earlier, when you have really low population, there's so much or so many, I guess, resources available, right? There's plenty of space, there's plenty of water, there's plenty of food. So theoretically, without any other influencing factors like hunting or anything, then your population would go up. Does anybody else have any other comments? No? Okay. I'm just going to move on then. Okay, so we're going to use a growth model to figure out what happened to the lions after 1963. Can you guys see my chat when I bring it up? Is it in my screen share? Because I figured out how to bring the chat up, but I don't want to be blocking it.
Yeah, we can see it.
You can see it? Okay.
Yeah.
No, we can't. I can't see your chat, but
no, yeah. Yeah,
Okay,
you can't see what someone's writing, like what someone has written to you.
So, Cheyenne, wouldn't the genetics not allow the population to increase for a long time? So do you mean like as in because they're so limited genetically that they wouldn't survive well?
Not for like a long period of time after the population crash, no.
Yeah, so that's valid as well. And that's a lot of what people discuss when they're talking about especially endangered species and having these breeding programs. And it's like, if you already have so few individuals, are you really like, are you compromising the integrity of the population, I guess, by allowing them to like interbreed so much? So yeah, you definitely could have really reduced, how do I put it? They'd have like a reduced ability to survive, but that's a lot of why they bring in different populations a lot of the time, right? So you bring in closely related populations and kind of add to the genetic pool, or they have captive breeding programs where they can release them into the wild, and then that way they're increasing the diversity. But it's a good point. So our growth model to figure out what happened to the lions after 1963. So we're going to learn about growth models, and we'll use bacteria as a simple example. So bacteria reproduce constantly. So let's say if we put a single bacterium in a petri dish with some agar, these bacteria would reproduce by cell division once per hour. So each time a cell divides, it gives rise to 2 cells. So can you predict what the growth curve may look like over 12 hours? So draw your prediction, and we'll click from point to point. So what do you guys think?
Exponential.
Yeah, so we're going to start really low. Is it going to click for me? Oh, I drew it wrong. Oh, well. You get what I mean. It goes up, 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 up. It's not clicking for me. Oh, I can reset it. There we go. So if we go, it goes like this, sort of, kind of, right? You're going to start low, and it's going to go up and up and up until you end up hitting your final capacity. So they just made theirs longer than mine, but same idea. Mine just grew way faster. So as you can see, the population starts off growing very slowly, but then it starts to grow faster and faster. Between 4 and 6 hours, the population goes from 16 to 32. And between 11 and 12 hours, the population goes from 2,048 to 4,096. So it's exponential growth. So this is called exponential growth, or a J curve. This type of growth occurs when there's enough space and food and other resources for every single bacterium. If we let the population of bacteria grow in the petri dish for 24 hours, this is what the graph looks like. So in which hour are the bacteria growing the fastest? Anybody?
The 12th?
Yeah, so right in here somewhere, like between this point and this point. Well, I guess I should have clicked this point, but yeah, in this highlighted green area, that's where they're growing the most, because you can see we have our bacteria on this side, and this between here and here is bigger than any of these dots. So you have the most your most growth the longer that they're there. So unlike bacteria, lions cannot divide once an hour, but their populations can undergo exponential growth. So the crater is 2,000 feet deep with 100 square mile floor, et cetera, et cetera. So the lion population, hypothetical data from 1950 to 1962, and the real data from 1963 to 1980, and our prediction, which we didn't do a prediction, but we said it would go up. So basically, we were right? The population did rebound up to here, and then it hit a peak and then it kind of did a little mini crash there again, but not all the way down to the bottom. So do you guys think that this rate of growth will continue to increase? Why or why not?
It won't continue to increase because it's reached its population capacity.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So once it hit this little high point, it basically, you ended up getting to the point where there weren't enough resources to support the entire population of lions, and that's why it kind of crashed down. But hopefully it will stay around this level and have little fluctuations here and there. But that means that your population is pretty stable, right? So our limiting factors. So we showed that they had exponential growth for the first part, but obviously, as Cheyenne said, once they hit the capacity, they're being limited by density-dependent factors. So, for example, with the bacteria example, our petri dish would eventually run out of food, and so they wouldn't be reproducing as much. So food was our limiting factor. So what would be 3 potentially limiting factors that might affect the population in the crater? So somebody give me one of them.
Food, water.
Oh.
Food, water. Let me just check the chat. Yeah, so prey, so food, migration, yeah. Especially if you're getting because of lions being kind of like territorial. So if you are having your prides and they're growing and you're having more and more offspring, you end up with like male lions setting out on their own, and they'll emigrate, right? They'll be leaving. The other potential you could have that it wouldn't necessarily be density dependent, but because of humans and how we work, you could potentially consider something like humans hunting the animals to be density dependent, because we have hunting laws in place that protect endangered species, right? So if there's very few of them, then you might have less people hunting them. Although in a lot of places in Africa and stuff, if you get people that are willing to pay enough money, you'll still be able to hunt them. But something more like animals around here. So for example, like there's snapping turtles, right? For hunt snapping turtles, they collect them and you can eat them, but now you can't do that. They've put a ban on hunting them unless you have indigenous treaty rights, because their populations are really low, right? So that's kind of different when it comes to humans. Obviously, if we were, something that was hunting the lions, like animals that were hunting the lions, and we didn't have any studies about what their populations were like, and we had no concerns about the sustainability, then it wouldn't necessarily be density dependent. But also it could be if you're, for example, if you're a predator and you are kind of more opportunistic rather than specializing, if your prey is getting less and less and less, then you might start to try to hunt other things just because they're more readily available, and hone your skills at hunting those things, right? But is there anybody else that has any other ideas that we haven't talked about yet of potential limiting factors that could affect the population? I'll take that as a no. Okay, so the available resources in the crater can support a certain number of lions, just like the petri dish can support a certain number of bacteria. So when limiting factors affect population growth, we describe it as logistic or an S-curve. Both density-dependent and density-independent limiting factors can influence the growth of populations. So density-dependent limiting factors include food, space, shelter, water, disease, and predation. For example, a large population of lions would probably decrease if the zebras died out, whereas a small population of lions would be fine. Density-independent limiting factors include weather and natural disasters. So let's click on a point on the graph where you think competition for space is low for the bacteria. So if competition for space is low, then they're going to have their population growing, right? So I don't know, we'll do one of these ones. Oh, chat. Anywhere before K half. Yeah, exactly. So once it's before you reach half of your carrying capacity, you have really low competition for space. Exactly, Taylor. So yeah, this whole green highlighted area. So food is a good example of a density-dependent limiting factor that could inhibit a population growth. So what do you think will happen to the rate of lion populations after 1980? So will it grow faster and faster or start to slow down? And remember that the lion population was between 75 and 100 individuals before the disease outbreak. So does anyone have any predictions?
It would probably oscillate around 100.
Yeah, probably. So if we just go like, I don't know, we'll do, I didn't connect the dots properly. Oh, well, you get exactly what Cheyenne said, probably around 100, maybe a little bit below because it was between 75 and 100 before the disease outbreak. And so you can probably assume that under non-stressful conditions that it would be around the same. And that's kind of what this little piece of the data is telling us here, where it crashed when it got up to about 110. Did a little crash, but it started coming up once it got down to 90. So yeah, we're probably in there somewhere. So the number of individuals that an environment can support is called the carrying capacity, or K. The limiting factors determine carrying capacity, which is generally the highest population, the highest population of resources, food, space, etc. can support. So competition for resources is highest when the population is near your carrying capacity. As was said by Taylor, the lowest competition is when you're below half of your carrying capacity. And populations usually grow exponentially in the first half of your logistic growth curve and then stabilize at your carrying capacity. So draw a line to estimate our carrying capacity of the Petri dish. So does anyone have any, where do you guys think your carrying capacity is?
6,000?
Yeah, right around there. Somewhere in there. Yeah, so it's about 6,000, and you can see that because it levels off, as Cheyenne said. So here are two data sets from 1950 to 1962 and 1963 to 1980. Remember that the first set, or the blue, is the hypothetical carrying capacity, while the orange one was collected by scientists in the field. On the x-axis, year 0 represents 1963, which is when the study began. So draw a line to estimate the average carrying capacity of the environment prior to the disease outbreak that took place in the early 1960s. So as we said, Cheyenne said it'd be around 100, but we'll probably be somewhere in the middle here. So the carrying capacity is the maximum number of lions. Yeah, so it's the average. So I drew it a little high.
Wouldn't it be around 80 then if it would be the average?
Yeah. Why is it not letting me reset it?
Just drag the dots, I think.
Oh, there you go. I didn't want to bother resetting it before. Let's go here-ish. Yeah. So 70 to 90 lions. You like my fancy little prediction curve? Not super great. So using what you know about carrying capacity, redraw a new prediction of the lion population after 1963. So what do you guys think?
Same curve.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to bother drawing it because we have troubles drawing. So compare your prediction to the real data. What do you notice? If there are differences, can you suggest some causes? So essentially our prediction, which I know I didn't draw, but our prediction was essentially the same, right? So we figured it would kind of go down. Because even like as Cheyenne said, you're going to have, well, we didn't think it was going to go down quite as far as it did. We figured it was going to stay somewhere around here, right? But also with increasing pressures from, say, hunting or habitat loss or, well, I guess poaching, but you have a lot of other factors that are coming into play as our world modernizes and as our human populations grow. Can anyone else think can you think of any other reasons why it might have gone down further than and not just stabilized at about what our carrying capacity would be and why it's down here instead?
Could be weather dependent.
Mm-hmm. That was one thing I was hoping somebody would say, especially with climate change, right? And if you have really hot summers and you're having less water, or if that's impacting the grazing habitat for your zebras and stuff, right, that could lower your lion population. So the population decrease below the 70 to 90 lion average carrying capacity in the crater before 1963. As previously mentioned, density-dependent limiting factors were thought to include food, space, shelter, water, disease, and predation. The limiting factors that determine the carrying capacity of the crater may be different today than they were 50 years ago. Which of the following is a density-independent limiting factor that could cause a fluctuation in the carrying capacity between 1995 and today?
If there's a drought.
Mm-hmm. So if we had, so our other options, so African wild dogs move into the crater and compete with the lions for their wildebeest and zebra prey. A disease wipes out most of the zebras or half of the craters. Miles are fenced off for the development of a game reserve. Those would all be density dependent, right? So the drought has nothing to do with how many lions there are. If there's a drought, and their population is going to go down. So yeah, it's an example of weather or natural disaster, which is density independent. But a drought can cause many density dependent factors, such as lower food availability. So in this case, the current lion population would no longer be supported by the environment and would decline. So now we're getting into our human population. So this is the graph of the human population. So we have our red, which is our actual population growth. The blue is the highest United Nations predicted population growth. And our orange is our median population estimate, and our green is the lowest population estimate. So given the shape of these graphs, do you think that Earth's population will reach its carrying capacity, and what might be some limiting factors? What do you think will happen if we do reach carrying capacity? So does anybody want to comment on any of that?
Pandemic.
Yeah, that was one thing that I figured would probably get brought up. So that would definitely be a limiting factor. And it is, as we can see, with what we're living through with COVID, it is density dependent, right? The more of us there are, the tighter we're packed into spaces, the more spread you're going to have of a disease, right? What about, does anyone have any thoughts on, do you think that the Earth's population will reach carrying capacity?
It will.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else think that it won't? Is there anyone that thinks it won't? There's somebody in the chat. Yeah, you think it will? Yeah, so you guys are probably most likely right, which is why we are definitely, okay, as kind of a side note, if you guys get a chance to take Biodiversity and Conservation, they talk a lot about that. And if I remember correctly, it's that we're using so many resources that it's like 2.5 times what the Earth should be sustaining, and we just haven't caught up with it yet. But that's a lot of why we are talking about, like, people are talking about space exploration, right? And can we get resources from somewhere else? But a lot of it is, how do I put it? A lot of it, like if you talk to a lot of the environmental scientists, especially like out of Living with Lakes, and you look at like the Sudbury story, which I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with it, but if you're talking about all that, a lot of people propose that the way that we solve these problems is that our waste products and our pollution is essentially just a result of us not having, not using our resources as efficiently as possible, right? So even in Sudbury, as many of you probably know, they mined all this ore out of the ground, and when they smelt it, it releases sulfur dioxide into the air, and then it mixes with all the water in the air, and we had acid rain, and that's what killed a lot of the vegetation. But what ended up prompting a change was that the government enforced these laws on Sudbury because we were the largest point source. Like, we were releasing more SO2 than all of Europe per year. And so the government enforced these regulations, and basically they found a way to capture all of that sulfur dioxide that was going up into the air and make sulfuric acid and sell it to people. So it's not going into the air, it's going into an industrial market, and they actually found a way to make money off of it. And a lot of places are doing similar things with carbon dioxide. They're trying to figure out ways of how can we actually use what is a waste product and make it into something we can use. So that's also an interesting way to look at it, just as like kind of a side note for how you're thinking about sustainability. But yeah, Cheyenne says humans as a whole are afraid of dying due to overpopulation. So yeah, it is. And especially what is sad is that we have, so as they said, our population growth is going down. And hopefully, what's sad is that there have been policies and stuff instituted to even like further limit, so like forced sterilizations and issues like that have come into play in the past to limit population growth, especially of certain demographics. And those are horrifying, obviously, right? But there is this population problem that people are afraid of. And so figuring out how to deal with it is really, really difficult, right? Humans are afraid of dying. Not overpopulation is seen with children still being born. So yeah, children are still being born, but a lot of it too, if you look at it economically, a lot of things that people, so our economy is also set up, right, that we should, it's set up on the basis that we're going to have an ever increasing population. So you're going to have more young people feeding into all of these social programs like Social Security and Canada Pension and all these things. And so you're going to have, that's how our system's set up, is you have a lot more young people working to contribute and support all these social programming. And so a lot of our problems, especially in these developed countries, is because we're having less offspring. You're not having that input, right? Yeah, that's why everyone's broke. Yeah, so it's such a complicated issue. And like I said, I would highly encourage you guys take classes like Biodiversity and Conservation if you're interested in this kind of thing, because they talk about all these different issues that have been going on for quite a long time, longer than I thought they had been. And it really like opens your eyes up to exactly like what's happened in the world. So that's just like a side note on my experience. I think it's a really valuable class to take and something really worth considering taking in your time at Laurentian. I don't know if they're offering it online right now.
Yeah, they are. I'm in it.
Okay, yeah.
I was going to say, yeah, it's being offered. I'm in it too.
Is it Nasrullah that's teaching it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I'm not sure how his teaching style would translate to online learning that well, but definitely the content of the class is really great. And Nasrullah is really nice and really like helpful, especially if you contact him one-on-one. He's really great. But yeah, I don't know. Have you guys talked about stuff like that in your class yet?
We have a little bit, like just in terms of kind of the resources we use and like how much we, I guess, like needs to be harvested for us to use it. And we've also talked about like the exact same thing, like how much waste we put out, and for every one person born, how much work needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even like they were saying in the videos, if you have a lot of other countries, like the less urbanized, well, not less urbanized, how do I put it? A lot of countries that have really high populations, they have less, they use less resources per capita. So even they were talking about in Johannesburg in South Africa, they have a real problem with water. They have droughts and they're having a lot of really big issues. But when they were looking at, they had a really big drought a couple of years ago, I think. But there were all these people that were complaining, and they're like, oh, well, it's all these like poor people that are using all the water. But when they actually looked into it, it's like there's all these rich people that have these swimming pools that are full of water, and they're filling up their swimming pools. They have their green lawns. Everything's all fine and good. And then these other people are rationing on like a couple liters of water a day. And so it's also this like what society's telling you, right? And it's this whole like marketing thing. And so, yeah, we could all stand to try to live more sustainably. especially those of us with a lot of like privilege, living in these areas where I know I definitely am guilty of using more resources than I really need to. And it should be, anyway, I've kind of gone off topic. I apologize. But it's, like I said, I would recommend taking classes like biodiversity and conservation if you're interested in these types of issues. Anyway, back to what we were talking about. So I guess it's not that much off topic. So we talked about, do you think it'll reach carrying capacity? So we said yes. And what might be some limiting factors? So did anybody, I don't think anybody specifically listed, but even in what we were talking about, so us as human beings have developed these economic systems, and so you need money to survive, right? There's not a lot of people, at least in like North America, that are really surviving like off of subsistence farming. So you need money. And so that could be a limiting factor, is just our world economies are a limiting factor, because if people are starving to death, then that's definitely a limiting factor. Can anyone think of any other limiting factors on the human population that might cause us to reach our carrying capacity?
War?
Yeah, so, but usually war breaks out either directly or indirectly because of some limiting resource. So especially going forward with climate change and everything, they're talking about us having more and more wars over fresh water, right? So that can be, pollution can be a limiting factor. So if you're having really, really high pollution rates, that could even lead to issues in terms of like human health, right? So if it reduces our fecundity, if it reduces our ability to produce offspring, that definitely would have an impact. Another limiting factor that a lot of people might be becoming more and more aware of, especially as we're in lockdown, is just purely space, right? Like, I know we're a little bit far from that, but especially in urban centers and very populated countries, even just space is becoming an issue for people, just finding somewhere to live, and space for agriculture and space for producing our food. So what do you guys think will happen if we do reach carrying capacity?
I think if we do reach carrying capacity, obviously we're going to have very limited resources because we're all fighting for the exact same resources. And kind of like the crash course video we watched was talking about, we're in a mass extinction event currently, so there could be some sort of like natural disaster that wipes out a lot of the population or a majority of the population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just like as Taylor said in the chat, so a large population decline over a short period before evening out a bit. Yeah, so that even happened. The old and sick would die first, and then the rebellions will break out by the poor people and take out the rich. Very revolutionary. But even similar things happened. So I don't remember what class I was in that we were talking about it, but just prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was like a huge, how would you put it, like a cold snap, I guess. And a lot of people starved to death because the crops, like they got frost way earlier than they were expecting, and people were freezing to death, people were starving to death. And the Industrial Revolution is kind of what saved our population, because there was a little dip in our human population before that because we were having really like climatic stress. But of course, with increasing industrialization, we can build structures that are more suitable to extreme environments that can keep us alive and usually pretty comfortable during extreme climatic events. So yeah, there's a lot of that. Does anyone else have any other comments? Nothing in particular. Pop drops or we go extinct. Yep. Basically, I mean, yeah, like humans could be especially not only will our population drop, but here's a question that's not asked in this specific exercise, I guess. But do you guys think that we have the potential to, like, by limiting our per capita resource use and reducing, like, do you think that we really have the ability to reduce our carrying capacity? Or, I mean, increase our carrying capacity by reducing the per capita resources we use through our lifestyle choices?
Not really.
Not really? Why not?
Well, because everybody has a different mindset, and not everybody will follow through with the restrictions if they're imposed.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, what you said kind of applies to Johnny's question in the chat too. So he asked, like, is it on a personal level or a national level? So I guess I'm talking about, yeah, it's like, do we have, because on a personal level, I'm pretty sure most of us, I know I definitely can think of many places where I could reduce my per capita resource use. But yeah, in order to make change, you'd probably have to do it on a national or international country, or national or international level. So it's doable in some countries, but not under current government structure in North America. Yeah. So that's, yeah, definitely a good point. But also considering the fact that our world has a lot of really big inequities, right? So in a lot of the poorer countries, people are definitely living on, like, fewer per capita resources than other areas, right? So, like, I would be willing to bet that I'm definitely I'm using more resources than somebody who's subsistence farming and just getting by with their family and making enough to feed their family and maybe a little bit of extra money. I'm definitely using more resources than they are. So even just our lifestyle considerations and what we consider to be essentials and what we consider to be things that we wouldn't be willing to give up on are definitely impacting, right?
I have a personal experience with this. I used to live in Shanghai, China, and the amount of money I spent per day to live was around $2, give or take. And I calculated what I'm using now, and it's about $17 per day.
Yes, that's a lot more. But it's, yeah, like, part of it is, like, our societies. So I'm assuming anybody that's in this class, and I could be totally wrong, it could be a horrible assumption that I'm making, but probably most of you have at least been in Sudbury. And so somewhere like Sudbury, in my mind, at least where I live, because I live on, like, the outskirts, I essentially, like, need a car to get anywhere that I'm going. The bus system isn't super efficient, and Sudbury's pretty spread out. But there are a lot of eco-cities, which I think are discussed in the Biodiversity and Conservation class, I think. But, like, in Brazil, they have different eco-cities where there is no traffic with, like, personal vehicles. They have all public transit and walking, and they've built their city around that, because that's just, like, what is expected. And so they have less, like, at least with fossil fuels, they're using less resources, right? And they have, I believe it's like all the lower levels are shops and they're like grocery stores and stuff. And then all the upper levels are places where people live. So the buildings are all multi-purpose and you're within walking distance of, like, any essential service that you need. But at the same time, if you're all living in apartment buildings, that could also negatively impact you in situations like a pandemic, right? So it's a give and take. Does anybody else have anything they want to say about just our human population? No? Okay. So congratulations, everyone. We've learned about exponential growth and logistic growth, carrying capacity, and density-dependent and independent limiting factors. So we made predictions, we interpreted graphs, and we applied population models to real data sets. And I'd argue we went even further with our discussions. So we can answer these questions. So how can we apply population models to real world data? What factors influence how populations change over time? We've talked about that. We've talked about what the difference between exponential and logistic growth. How can we apply population models to real world data? What inferences can we make about the human population? So is there any like comments on this? Because I think we kind of answered a lot of these questions when we were going through it, right? No more comments? I think that's the end. Should be the end. Yeah, so we finished the activity. Yay. Okay, so we can go through, do you guys want to go through the lion, or not the lion, the wolf example or the gypsy moth example first?
I just have a question. So yeah. I'm pretty sure this was asked in the lecture part, in the pre-lab part. So is the moth due or is it just the wolf?
It's just the wolf that's due, but we're going to go through the moth stuff like in lab right now. Okay, so just the wolf one needs to be submitted.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Any other questions or anything? No. Does anyone have any preference of whether we do the wolves or the gypsy moths first? In my mind, it would make sense to do the gypsy moth thing first and then do the wolf thing because you guys have to do the wolf thing and hand it in. Moth, wolf. So we're tied. Great. We need a tiebreaker. Somebody come in with their preference and we'll have a tiebreaker. Moth. Okay. Okay. We'll do the moths first and then we'll do the wolves. So, have you guys, is there anybody that hasn't like took a stab at answering the questions? Okay, I'll just read through it then. So if you were in Sudbury over the summer of 2020, you may have noticed that the birch trees were mostly devoid of leaves and there was a lot of poop on the ground under your car or on your car under said naked birch trees. You may have also noticed loads of caterpillars that looked like this roaming your neighborhood. And so they have a nice little picture, pretty but problematic. This was an outbreak year for invasive European gypsy moths. They even ate the leaves of the blueberry bushes behind my house. I know Dr. Litzkus wrote that, but same here. So say you're an entomologist working for the Canadian Forest Service and you've learned that there are 8 gypsy moths, 4 females and 4 males that were inadvertently introduced to the forest around French River. Their population grows with a constant per capita rate of 0.73 individuals per individual per year. So since the per capita growth rate is constant, what is the appropriate population growth model to use to model this situation? Anybody?
Exponential?
Yeah, so in exponential growth, the population's per capita or per individual growth rate stays the same regardless of your population size, making the population grow faster and faster as it gets larger. So can anyone suggest to me why their population growth is so constant?
Lots of food.
Yeah, lots of food, lots of space, because they're invasive, right? So they're coming into an area where there's very few predators. They have plenty of food, they have plenty of space, and so nothing's really stopping them from growing. So that's probably their optimal growth rate. So in nature, populations might grow exponentially for a while, but they will ultimately be limited by resource availability. So in logistic growth, the population's per capita growth rate gets smaller and smaller as the population size approaches a maximum, which is imposed by the limited resources. So our carrying capacity, K. So after 5 years, how many gypsy moths are in the forest? Did anybody do the math? So we already said you'd be using the exponential population growth. Here, let me just, I'll share my screen so you guys can see it again.
I tried it out and I got 307.8 in 5 years.
Yeah, I got the same answer.
Perfect. Great. So let's just went over the whole like the derivative thing with you guys, right? And how to do derivatives. I think she's told me she did that. Yeah, me too. Okay. So great. So anybody that didn't do it, you can try doing it on your own. If you have any problems, again, please email me. Let me just get back to our little page. So you guys got the same answer and you all are using the same formula and you wrote the intermediate steps of your work. So yeah, again, you don't have to hand it in. This is just for us to do. If you haven't done it, I would highly recommend that you do it. It's really great practice. And also, I know you guys already had your midterm, but Litzkus told me that there was lab content from the lab, or there was lab content on the midterms, and that I'm pretty sure that there will be lab content on your final, just as a guess. So you might want to brush up on these equations and stuff and know how to use them at least. So that went a little faster than I was expecting, but let's go to, we'll do our the wolf one. Where did I put it? So has anybody started working on the wolf data?
Yeah, I'm done that as well.
Okay, great. Oh wait, maybe it's in here. Aha, it is in here. Is there anybody that didn't do the wolf? Oh, here, let me check the chat. I didn't have time to finish the midterm. Yeah, I heard that there were issues with the midterm. So you haven't started the wolf one either. Okay, well, we can go through it. So our first question. So when the Yellowstone National Park was created in the late 1800s, wolves were on the decline. The last wolves in Yellowstone were killed in 1926, but in the 1800s, there were between 100 and 160 wolves in the park. In 1995, gray wolves were reintroduced to the park. Using what you know about populations, predict the growth of the wolves in the graph below. So can anyone tell me, especially somebody who hasn't done it yet, what kind of growth model do you think would be most likely to be seen in the wolves?
Exponential?
So yeah, it would definitely start as exponential, but do you think that the wolves would eventually reach a carrying capacity?
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So then it would end up, the first part would definitely be exponential, but they would eventually level out. How long that would take would really depend on what the resources are that are available, but because they were killed out and wiped out in the first place, when they're reintroduced, there should be plenty of resources for them, right? So my guesstimation of how long it would take, it depends on what the population is, but here is a little, I'll show you guys with my screen share. Just give me a second. There we go. Okay, so this is what I basically have. So it's going to level out, and it's probably going to level out at close to what it was. So they said, I believe it was between 140, what was it? Yeah, they're between 100 and 160 wolves in the park. So it's probably going to level out somewhere between 100 and 160. So I kind of did it like halfway between. But again, how long this would take and how stretched out it would be very dependent on the resources that are available, especially when you're dealing with different types of animals. So like wolves, depending on what they're eating, if they're really dependent on your snowshoe hare population, their populations are pretty cyclical, right? So your population would be going up and down and up and down and up and down with their prey population. Or same thing if there was one of the non-density dependent or density independent factors, I guess, like some natural disaster, then you could have another drop. But assuming none of those things and that you're just having pretty steady, it would probably be something like this.
How many wolves did they introduce in the first place?
I don't know. Did it say?
No.
Then I have no idea. I have no idea. But I know that the whole wolf thing in Yellowstone is very contentious because, especially, another recommendation for a class you guys should take is wildlife management with Dr. Mallory. I really enjoyed that class. And I'm not just saying that because he's my supervisor now. I really did enjoy that class. But there was a lot of predator control programs in the US where you could kill like coyotes and wolves because they're very agricultural, right? So they wanted to protect their livestock, and they basically were allowing you to kill coyotes and wolves with by any means necessary. So like explosives and poisons and stuff like that, which a lot of people consider very inhumane. And there is some concern in Ontario that, and I don't know if you guys are aware of it, but if you guys want to look it up more, if you want to ask me more about it, you can email me or whatever, and I can send you links and stuff. But yeah, they're basically reducing the restrictions. So it used to be you couldn't hunt any wolves or coyotes. You could trap them if you have a trapping license, but you had, there's the Algonquin wolf that they're worried about, and you can't really easily distinguish. So they weren't allowing hunting. But now they're introducing, because there's a lot of concerns, especially in Southern Ontario and agricultural areas, they're like removing bag limits and basically like letting people hunt as much as they want. So that's like bringing in modern wildlife management into your assignment. If you have any interest in that, you can look that up. And there's petitions and stuff. They put it through in an omnibus bill, so a lot of people weren't really aware when they did it. But there's been a lot of increasing like publicization, I guess, about the dangers of wolves and coyotes, and they're trying to find ways to control their population. And a lot of it they're saying is because they're hunting. They claim that the reason why they're allowing more hunting is because they're claiming the wolf population is what's causing the decline in the moose population. So saying the wolves are wiping out all the moose and that's why we need to control them. But there's like really no evidence for that, but I digress. Anyway, but if you're interested in that, the whole like history of wolves in North America is actually like a very fascinating history. And if you guys want some like news links or whatever, let me know and I can hook you up because it's pretty cool. So our type of growth, which is kind of what we were discussing before. So we said it would be a logistic growth. So it's going to start low and go up. List 3 density dependent factors that could slow our population growth. So can anyone think of any density dependent limiting factors?
The amount of prey?
Yeah, definitely the amount of prey. Food, yeah, mates, that's a good point. Especially because it depends on what the social structure is, right? So wolves are pretty cool in that like they have your alpha male and your alpha female, and they're the ones that mate. Otherwise you don't really. But definitely like in terms of mating, you could have wolves that are dispersing, and that's a lot of why you end up with lone wolves, is because they are challenging the whole hierarchy structure and then they go off on their own, right? Seasonal predators, yeah, so that definitely could be a thing. Maybe not so much for the wolves because they'd be protected. They're protected in Yellowstone, but people camp out near the border of Yellowstone and shoot any wolf that goes across the border. So you know, that would definitely be seasonal predators, like as humans. But for wolves, they tend to be close to the top of the food chain. So that'd probably be a lesser impact for them. So I can't think of anything other than humans that would be hunting wolves, other than maybe other wolves. I don't know if that's a thing. I don't know. Immigration. So yeah, that kind of links up to what we were talking about with mates. So yeah, there's food. Another thing that I think a lot of people tend to overlook is water. Fresh water is really, really key. Maybe not so much in an area like Yellowstone or like even Algonquin, because we have a lot of inland lakes, but especially when you're dealing with places that have a lot of drought and a lot of salt water, fresh water is huge. Territory, yeah, because wolves are very territorial. That's also linked to like the immigration and mates. Disease, definitely. So if there's different issues with a disease spreading through the population, that could definitely limit them. And the male to female ratio. Yeah, so that's another important thing. I don't know if it's been documented in wolves as being an issue, but I know that they've had documentation in other species, especially different things like lizards and turtles, where the sex of the like offspring can be dependent on temperature. So a lot of the issues they're having, I forget what species it was exactly, but there was one species where basically it's like the temperature of the eggs determines whether they're male or female. And so if it's warmer, then you end up with a male, and if it's cooler, then you end up with a female. And then that way, like you should end up with, throughout the nest, you would get different sexes, right? And you get a good like ratio to continue on the population. But with global warming, everything's warming up, and so you're ending up with a whole bunch of males and no females to mate with, and therefore their population's going down. Painted turtles? Is it painted turtles? Okay, maybe. I don't know. I don't remember what it was, but it's definitely a problem. Yeah, lots of reptiles. Yeah. But definitely you could have an issue if there was something that was skewing. I don't know how that would be, because wasn't our question. Let me just review the question. What was the question? So density dependent. So yeah, but if you had, so something like the ratio of males to females, that would be more density independent, I would think, unless there was something about the population that was driving it, where you have, and this could happen, I'm not saying it doesn't, but where when you have more and more, like your population's getting higher and higher, if you have like differing sex ratios. That sounds familiar, but it could just be something in my head. But that wouldn't, yeah, normally that wouldn't be a density dependent factor. But it's still a good point nonetheless, that would be a limiting factor. And but yeah, so territory, immigration, those things would all be, well, actually emigration, I don't know if that'd be a factor. Emigration would more be because like that would be something that would cause the decline, but it wouldn't be the factor that's actually limiting it, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? So if there's not enough territory, then a lot more wolves might be prompted to leave. And then they'd be emigrating, but the emigration isn't the factor. Does that make sense? Somebody tell me if what I just said makes sense to them.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, good. Does anybody else have any other density dependent limiting factors?
Would habitat fragmentation count? Because the area that they can inhibit gets smaller, and so as the population increases, they would run out of space.
So that would be like really linked to territory, and like I get where you're going with it, but the habitat fragmentation isn't dependent on how big the wolf's population is, right? So the habitat fragmentation is reducing the amount of territory, but ultimately the limiting factor is that there's less territory, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think you pretty much, like, I think you guys covered off everything that I can think of anyways. So population stabilize at blank, the maximum number of individuals an environment can support. Can anybody give me that answer? Somebody other than Cheyenne, because she's been answering a lot. What about Allie, since you're unluckily the first person on my alphabetical list? Was the previous maximum, yeah, so between 140 and 160. So yes, so Taylor's right, because 160 was the previous maximum, so probably between 140 and 160. Yeah, but what more of what they're looking for is like, what is the term for, not like the actual number. I get where you're going with it, and yes,
Is that
but more.
Oh,
Is it carrying capacity?
Yeah, exactly. The carrying capacity. So Taylor was right, but I think they're looking for the term like carrying capacity, or K, as the maximum number of individuals in the environment, or that the environment can support. But yes, it would be probably around there. So yeah, carrying capacity. So in logistic growth, where is competition for resources highest? Let me pick somebody. I'll just go down the list. Why not? How about Annalisa?
The competition between the wolves will be the highest when the population is at a high and there will be few resources available. The resource competition would be highest around the carrying capacity.
Yeah, exactly. And so basically, as somebody else, I forget who it was, but somebody did mention when we were talking before about when the bacteria would have the most resources available, it's when it's under half of the carrying capacity. So yeah, you're right. They would have the most competition when they're at carrying capacity, because that's when there's just enough resources for every individual. But you start seeing increasing competition once you hit about halfway to carrying capacity, because before that, there's plenty of resources, right? Next question. Are there any wild populations that undergo endless population growth? Why or why not?
Are humans wild?
Depends on who you ask, I guess. But I'm going to go with no on this one. How about Anish?
I actually missed the question.
Can you think of any wild populations that undergo endless population growth?
Do insects count?
Yeah, I guess they would.
All right, so insects it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. So insects, I mean, they would eventually hit their carrying capacity, but yeah, in a lot of cases, like if you've ever had like a fruit fly infestation, as I am dealing with right now, they really have like really good population growth because there's so many resources available. They will eventually hit a carrying capacity, but they're so small and they live for such a short amount of time. And relative to their size and what they need, there's so much available that, yeah, I would agree. If there was any wild population that grew exponentially, I would say probably some sort of insect would be the only one that might qualify. So we already said why or why not. Can anybody else think of anything? Oh, there's a chat thing. Close to or could appear to, but no. Yeah. So yeah, basically, Charlie, you're right. Is there anybody that can think of maybe also bacteria? Yeah, so bacteria, that's a good point, Cameron. Bacteria can also, it's okay. I like the caps. It shows enthusiasm. It's good. I like it. But yeah, that's another good point. Just like Anisha's point was really good. Bacteria, they tend to grow exponentially during the first part, and usually like, as Charlie said, it wouldn't necessarily actually be exponential growth, but it can appear exponential because they have such a high carrying capacity in their environment. Next question. So are humans different? Tricky question, kind of playing into what Cheyenne said. Let's do, I can ask Cameron, but he already answered a question. Oh, fungi. Are you saying like fungi would be as a suggestion of what could appear to be exponential, Cheyenne?
If you count their genetics, the same organism growing exponentially, but like if they reproduce as different organisms, if that was the question, then no.
Yeah. So you're meaning like they can, like a fungus can grow exponentially because they just keep like with their hyphae, they just keep branching out, kind of similar to like the trembling aspen, right? Like where it's kind of one big organism, even though you might have lots of fruiting bodies or lots of little trees, but there's still one big organism. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we're talking mainly about like populations, but yeah, good point, right? Definitely worth like discussing. My list got all messed up. It's not in alphabetical order anymore. Oh wait, yes it is. Never mind. Okay. Okay, Cameron, what's your opinion? You can either do it in the chat or on your microphone. Do you think humans are different? Do you think that we can grow exponentially?
No, because as we've established, humans do have a carrying capacity, but we don't really know what it is, but there is definitely a cap off.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I would 100% agree. And I think much like they discussed in the crash course video, that part of the problem is us as humans because of our engineering skills and our long lifetimes. I would argue that we've raised our carrying capacity by being able to take advantage of stored energy sources that other organisms can't. So like things like fossil fuels, right? Those are stores that have existed for millions of years, at least thousands of years, if not millions of years. And we found a way to harness all those energy sources from the past. And so we're kind of living on borrowed energy and using that to increase our populations. But really, other animals can't take advantage of those, right? And they're going to run out at some point. They're finite. They will reach an end. So now you guys need to draw a proper figure with appropriate caption and axes with labels of the predicted growth curve as per question 1 above for the Yellowstone wolf population, and hand it in to me as an email attachment or via D2L, preferably by D2L, by the end of the day today. So we took it as midnight. You guys can either use Excel or you can draw it by hand. I would recommend you use Excel just because it's good practice. And I find that there's a lot of students who struggle with using Excel, and this is a pretty easy introduction to it. You're just making a graph. One thing I will caution you about, actually a couple things that I will caution you about, because we are doing a proper figure, don't necessarily follow the like template, I guess, that was given at the top, where it's like the Yellowstone wolves at the top of your, here, I'll just share my screen. Oh, and the popcorn lab is due Monday next week. Yes, I believe so. It's due on the 9th. Where are we pulling the wolf data? I believe that you would just be like essentially like making it up. We can ask Litskis, but yeah, you would be like making it up to show what you think would happen to the population. So yeah, this thing right here where it has like the little like grid lines and everything, don't do that. Don't do it. When we want a proper figure, usually you don't put any grid lines in the background. There's usually no color. That's something that people I have heard have made a lot of mistakes on. I'd like it if you guys could make it in Times New Roman. I know it can be a bit of a pain on Excel, but that would be nice. Okay, because it's only like 2:47, is there anybody that wants like kind of a mini tutorial on how to do graphs in Excel? Oh, and Cheyenne says apparently 41 wolves were introduced. So does everyone feel good with their abilities in Excel, or do you guys want me to show you like a little?
I'm good.
You're good?
Also good.
Okay, cool. So I'm glad you guys are good with Excel. Again, the key things to remember. So you need a caption, and figure captions go below the figure, whereas I know like table captions go above, but figure captions go below. Black and white, don't do gray, please. Normally, if you had this one, you'll only have one line, so it shouldn't be that big of an issue. But normally, if you had multiple lines, you would have different like markers. So instead of having like different colored lines, your markers for each data point, like you could have one's a triangle and one's an X and one's a square or whatever. So that's another biggie. It's kind of becoming less relevant as there's more online publications, but still color. And what else was I going to say? No grid lines. Try to do it in Times New Roman and black font, because Excel, at least in my case, Excel always defaults to, I think, Calibri, and it makes it this weird gray color. I think that's it. But yeah, proper figure, and you need, I think they said, a little blurb about why you chose that. Yeah, labeled axes. Oh yes, label your axes. That's important. Proper figure caption. Similar to your table, it should be complete enough that I can read it and know what your graph says without referencing any other text. So try to take like the same rules as I gave you for the table ones. And again, if you still are unsure about the table captions, like please email me and reach out, and I will do my best to explain. A small amount of text explaining your reasoning for your population curve. So yeah, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Are there any other questions, or does anyone have any comments about anything from the pre-lab to what we discussed now, or anything like that?
For this small blurb, you don't want it in our caption, like our table caption, our graph caption, sorry. You want it like underneath?
Yeah. So you'd have probably like your figure, and then you'd have your caption right underneath, and then you would have like your little blurb of like, my population growth curve looks like this because, you know, I think that they would follow, or I would think that the wolves would follow a logistic population curve because they were introduced when there's no resources, and then they're going to hit a carrying capacity because of A, B, C, D, whatever. So yeah, you'd have it separate from your caption, but your caption still needs to be complete. Any other questions?
And it's at the end, it's due at the end of today, right? And not by the end of the lab?
Yeah, it's due by midnight tonight. We were discussing what would be better, and we decided probably midnight, just in case people are having issues with like formatting or whatever. You guys have a chance to like reach out and try to get things solved so there's less people handing it in late. So yeah, you have till midnight tonight.
Do you want us to use sources to find existing data and then add on to it later?
I mean, it'd be great if you did. I don't think that it's required to. We can ask here. Maybe I can I? Oh, I don't have my option to ask Litskis to come here. If
it's supposed to be just a prediction, wouldn't it just be like our assumption of what it's going to look like?
Yeah, so that's basically, from my understanding, it would just be your assumption of what you think it's going to look like. You can, if you want, you can try to find data, but I don't think you were provided any data. I'll double check right now on the D12 page.
Provided any, no.
So yeah, it says, so using what you know about populations, predict the growth of the wolves on the graph below. So yeah, you can, it's just like a prediction. If you wanted to add on, you could, I guess, but I don't think you're going to get any like bonus marks. So I don't know if you want to bother. But if you just are curious and you want to cite stuff, go ahead. You can practice citing, but yeah, just like a kind of a prediction of what you would think, which I kind of already showed you guys what I did, but we discussed it as a group. Could you just
now?
Yeah, just I'm reading Johnny's question. Could you just double check the data points? What do you mean by that, Johnny? Like where we get them, but you already answered. Okay, as long as that's clear, then that's cool. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else that we need to do. So I would definitely take advantage of this time to do your figure, since it's due by midnight tonight. Yeah, if there's no other questions, I'll stick around if there's any questions that people want to ask, but Otherwise, I think you guys are free to go.
Thanks.
In that, there's Louise. So Zoe's still over there. Maybe I can't send her. Louise, you're free to go unless you have some questions for us. And I made the Dropbox for handing in. I went in and did that. There he is. Okay, see you, Louise.